Carrying on with our AMD Ryzen content, of which you guys and girls seem to love, and AMD have released quite a few processors in the 7000 series lineup, and some of them are actually quite close in terms of specs and naming. Which brings me on to today's video, where we're pitting the Ryzen 5 7600 against its bigger brother, the 7600X. And in typical eTechnics fashion, we've tested them both in 42 games at 3 resolutions to see which one really is the value king. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video sponsor. Oh mate, you alright? Yeah, just got all the bits for my banging new gaming PC. Just got to put it together. It's going to be so much better than yours. Oh, right. What did you get then? The latest Intel 12th gen processor, a feature-packed motherboard, and 32 gig of DDR4 memory. See? Miles ahead of yours. You realise that board needs DDR5 memory, don't you? Don't tell me you went and bought the wrong stuff. DDR4 is so 2014. I can't believe you was that stupid. What? No, you're joking. What should I get then? For me, I'd be looking at Corsair's newest Vengeance DDR5 kits. Or, if you're wanting that all-important RGB, then go for the Dominator Platinum RGB. Oh, you are a lifesaver. Thanks. But where can I find out more? By clicking the link in the description below, of course. You call me the stupid one. So let's start with the specs, because on paper, both CPUs are actually quite close to each other. To start with, both CPUs sport 6 cores and 12 threads and feature the same 32 megabytes of L3 cache. Beyond that, they are quite dissimilar, with the Ryzen 5 7600 coming in with a clock speed of 3.8 GHz and a boost clock of 5.1 GHz, while the 7600X comes in quite a bit faster with a base clock of 4.7 GHz and a boost clock of 5.3. Other than that, the only other kind of big key difference comes by the way of power delivery, with the Non-X having a 65 watt TDP and the 7600X coming in at 105 watts. So some differences, and due to the extra clock speed, you'd expect the X to come in faster. But what we want to see today is how much faster, along with which one offers up the better value for money proposition, especially considering that the 7600 can be had for $189 and the X comes in 10% more expensive at $208. So are you getting over 10% more performance for that money? Or will the 7600 come out the better bang for buck buy, considering its lower price point? Well, to test, we put both CPUs through the mill in 42 titles and at 3 resolutions. To test, we used the Gigabyte X670E Aorus Master with 32 gig of G.Skill Trident Z5 Neo, 6000 MHz CL30 memory. For all of our testing, we used an Inno3D RTX 4090 iChill X30C to rid the system of any GPU-based bottlenecks, and the latest version of Windows 11 was used with the latest drivers. All of the testing data is fresh, so everything is as up to date as it can be, and while we will be showing all resolutions, 1080p really is the focus here, as this is where the CPU utilization is at its highest. Now, we've tested both processors in a total of 42 games, and we'll be showing 15 here today, while also looking at the percentage differences between the two in all 42 titles. Though if you do want to see the individual data for all 42 games, then we will be putting them up onto our Patreon, where you'll also get a ton of other cool and exclusive benefits, as well as helping to support everything that we do on the channel. So, with that out of the way, let's get into those glorious benchmarks. Starting off like normal with a Plague Tale Requiem, and here we see that right off the bat that across the board there is only a margin of error difference between the two CPUs, and honestly this is what I'm expecting from most of the games that we're looking at. At 1080p and 4K, the 7600X manages to lead a single frame ahead of the Non-X chip, with 1440p taking a slightly wider 2 FPS lead. In the 1% lows, 1080p sees them matching perfectly, 1440p sees the 7600 taking a single FPS lead, while 4K sees the X ahead by a few frames. But all of these gaps are tiny and within margin of error anyway, so, well, you're never really going to notice them in game. In Assassin's Creed Valhalla, we see more small differences between the two CPUs. At 1080p, we only see the 7600X leading by a tiny 1% margin, while the lows arguably do have a wider gap of 6%, so you'll have a slightly smoother experience overall, but I can't explicitly say that it's worth the extra money. 1440p sees both processors only 1 FPS apart from each other in both the averages and the lows, with both of these having the 7600X seeing the slight edge as expected. 4K is much of the same story, where we're only seeing a difference of 2%, so overall there really isn't much to say, but we'll see how the rest of the game shape the overall picture. On to Baldur's Gate 3, where at 1080p the 7600X is ahead of the Non-X by a borderline margin of error result of 4%. Then at 1440p we can notice that the 7600 doesn't change its average FPS at all from 1080p, whilst the X actually manages to gain a few frames here, meaning that as a result we see the gap widen now to 5%. It's not much more, but it does mean that we're no longer bordering on margin of error, so I guess there is something to be said about it, though it's not as big of a gain as expected for the extra cost. 4K has the CPUs come in nigh on identically, separated by a single frame per second, so again, margin of error, but at 4K that's expected anyway, as the GPU takes over more of the workload. Call of Duty is next, and surprise surprise, we see the same thing. The two processors fall apart by just a margin of error difference of 1% across all resolutions, though I guess silver linings, it's nice to see the 7600X as the CPU that's slightly ahead, even if it is by a small amount. Though due to the price disparity, it doesn't exactly jump out at giving you extra value for money, and that is the case across 1080, 1440 and 4K, where the CPUs scale, but nothing really changes comparatively. Moving on to Counter-Strike 2, where at 1080p we see the 7600X outperforming its little brother by 3%, which is of course margin of error, but with it making up 17 FPS, you could argue that it's a little more significant than margin of error makes it sound. But with frame rates of over 400 FPS, who's realistically going to notice 17 frames per second anyway? At 1440p the gap widens a little to 4%, so still bordering on margin of error, but it is better regardless. Then at 4K the gap widens yet again as the 7600X manages to stretch its legs out to over 500 FPS, and with a performance difference of 8%, this is no longer something you could argue as margin of error, and is now comfortably better performing, which is good news for the 7600X, but still below the extra 10% cost. In Cyberpunk the differences are again quite small, with the 7600X beating the non-X CPU by 2%, and with identical lows. Then at 1440p the lows remain identical, whilst the performance gap widens to 4%, as the X CPU doesn't lose any performance, whilst the non-X loses a couple of frames. 4K is much more interesting, as even though the gap is still pretty small at 3%, the processors actually swap positions, and now the 7600 has a better FPS than the X variant, which is still pretty useless overall, as at just 2 FPS it really doesn't make any difference, and we'd call this identical anyway due to the margin of error difference, and retesting could see these line up somewhat more, though from our own retests it was very consistent. When we enable ray tracing we see a slightly different outcome from 1080p, as the 7600X manages to perform 7% better than the 7600 non-X. It only makes a 6 FPS difference, but it is a healthy percent above margin of error, so at least there is some benefit from the more expensive CPU, though it still does fall short when factoring in the cost disparity. At 1440p and 4K however, the two CPUs' performance lies neck and neck, as they both get completely identical performance, with the lows also matching perfectly at 4K, whilst they sit 1 FPS apart at 1440p, but it's still what we class as the same result, as it does come in so close. Moving over to F123, and straight away we see a borderline identical FPS coming from each processor, with the 7600 managing to come ahead by just 0.5% at 1080p, which is so close you might as well say it's exactly the same, especially with such high frame rates. Then at 1440p we see the gap get a little wider, but not by enough to make a substantial change, as we now sit with a 1% difference, and retesting could see the results swap places. Though again, our retests were very consistent, and it seems that the extra clock speeds make, well, no difference whatsoever in this game. 4K brings the two processors back together with a separation of just 0.3%, which equates to just 1 frame per second, and with performance being so high across the board, I'd argue that every comparison is, frankly, identical. Far Cry 6 gives us something with a little bit of substance at 1080p, where we see the 7600X taking a 4% lead over the non-X CPU. This then shrinks down to 1% at 1440p, which, needless to say, makes practically no difference, and then at 4K we see it go back up a little to 3%. Not fantastic results by any means, unless of course you're looking to buy the 7600 for slightly less money, in which case you'll probably feel pretty confident in that choice right about now, instead of going for the more expensive CPU for not much more performance. Hogwarts Legacy is going to make me sound like a broken record as I talk about even more results that are so close that you just can't tell the difference. And at both 1080p and 4K we see the 7600X outperforming the 7600 by 1%, so not really much to talk about. Then at 1440p the two CPUs perform identically in the averages, with a small difference coming in the lows, where the 7600X is actually outdone by the non-X CPU by around 5%, which is a bit more of an interesting result. But even more interesting than that is the 1080p lows, where the 7600 falls behind by quite some margin, with 20% less performance than the 7600X. Now at these frame rates, this is something you're more likely to notice, as a lower frame rate here means a rougher gameplay experience overall. And we also went about retesting this until we, well, frankly got fed up, as we kept consistently getting the same results and can really only put it down to the game being the anomaly here. Next up is Spider-Man, and here we have even more of the same, with the two CPUs coming in extremely close in terms of performance. So close in performance in fact that at 1080p and 1440p, the two chips perform identically, with the only difference coming by way of a 1 FPS lead that the 7600 has in the 1440p lows. So basically no difference. At 4K we arguably see some difference, but in reality we don't, as with just 2 frames per second separating the two CPUs, it's going to feel the same no matter which you're using. So I'd push you to get the cheapest CPU and just, well, save some money. Turning on ray tracing doesn't really change a whole lot, but with lower frame rates we might see some slightly larger percentages. And at 1080p we see exactly that, even if only barely. Here we have a small 3% bump in frame rate from the 7600X, which still doesn't account for much considering the higher price point. Then at 1440p we have the CPUs falling just a single FPS apart, with the X variant taking the lead as expected. 4K then switches things up a bit, as we now see the non-X leading by a single frame per second, and with all results again being so close together, you could say that performance is completely identical. Flight Sim seems to be able to take a little more advantage of the faster CPU, and we see this reflected in the results, with 9% more performance at 1080p from the 7600X, which is a substantial gain and does put the 7600X in a better light and closer to what you'd expect for the extra money. But with all good things, this has to fade, as at 1440p the difference shrinks to just 4%, which is right on the cusp of margin of error, but is expected as the workload is now being pushed over towards the GPU. Then at 4K, as you'd expect where the CPU is less important, the performance in the averages comes in identical, with the 7600X taking a small but minuscule lead in the 1% lows. Moving on to Remnant 2, we see another example of some slightly larger gaps coming from the 7600X, with 1080p giving us 5% more performance over the slower non-X part. 1440p narrows the results as you'd expect, but only down to 4%, meaning that the difference managed to stay pretty consistent between the two processors, with 4K then bringing the performance down a little more, now to 3%, which is within margin of error, but doesn't fall too far off the other results that we saw here. What is more worth pointing out though is that at 4K we do have some weirdness in the lows, where the 7600X falls behind by 10%, sitting under the 60 FPS mark, and retesting garnered the same results, but being an early UE5 based game, nothing really surprises me with this title. Last up is Watch Dogs Legion, and here unsurprisingly we see more of what we saw throughout the rest of the tests. 1080p and 1440p both see the 7600X performing 2% greater than the 7600. But with 1080p seeing the lows take a 6% lead in favour of the 7600X, whilst at 1440p we do have the lows actually matching. Then at 4K the difference is again basically nothing, talking only a single frame apart from each other in the averages, with the only separation coming by way of the 1% lows. But even then, it is still practically identical. So just from them 15 games, it's pretty clear to see that the performance is pretty much identical, with a slight edge to the 7600X as expected, though some games were able to utilise the extra speed from the 7600X, but even then it was, I guess, by a fairly small margin, and not enough to warrant the extra cost. Though to get a better idea as to how things do in comparison, it's worth taking a look at all 42 games. It's here when we look at the percentage differences at 1080p, we see that in most games there really isn't much between the two CPUs, with the 7600X only sitting an average of 3% ahead overall. Throughout these tests we saw most games coming in under 5% different, with the largest gap coming from Warhammer 40k Darktide, with the 7600X seeing 11% more performance, whilst the best the non-X CPU result managed to see was a 6% lead in Hunt Showdown. And after spending almost a full day retesting, we consistently saw the same result, and could be down to, I guess, a variety of reasons, including the difference in binning, the lower TDP, and therefore more stable and sustained levels of boost, or more than likely the game just being an anomaly. We also saw a few games that had the exact same performance on both chips, with these games being Tiny Tina's Wonderland, The Outer Worlds, Spider-Man, and Control. Of course, we have to look at the lows as well, as things are a bit more varied here. The 7600X manages to see a small boost overall, with it now pushing 4% ahead of the non-X across all of the games. We do see some much larger gaps here than we did in the averages, as now we have 3 games that sit over 20% different in favour of the 7600X, with Dying Light 2, Hogwarts Legacy and Warhammer Darktide. Darktide sees the largest of the differences with 27% more performance, which shows a more consistent level of gameplay, which will be noticeable in game. And finally, we have a small reason to buy the 7600X over the 7600 non-X. The 7600 also sees some much larger jumps compared to the averages, and now the best result it saw was again in Hunt Showdown, where we see it outperforming the X CPU by 15%. This isn't enough to make a significant difference to the standings, as most of the games saw the 7600X as the victor, which could make things, I guess, interesting when we look at the cost per frame. It's here where we find that at 1080p, the two CPUs actually found themselves with the same level of value, with under $1 per frame, which is nice to see given that the 7600X is 10% ahead in the overall averages. 1440p and 4K are a slightly different story, as the non-X CPU now falls behind in the cost per frame by a few cents in both resolutions. At 1440p, we saw the 7600X coming in 2% cheaper per frame for 11% more performance on average, while 4K sees the X being 5% cheaper for 15% more performance. So yes, there is a clear winner here in the 7600X, but for the price difference, I honestly think it's just fine to get whichever your budget can stretch to. But if it were me, I'd save a little more to get a few more frames, but that really is just personal preference. So this was a bit of an odd one. I never went into this expecting huge differences, so the results we saw really are right on the money. And I think this could be argued kind of either way. Yes, you're going to get more performance from the 7600X, but you're going to pay more for it too. But the big caveat here is we used an RTX 4090 for our test to eliminate any bottleneck. And if using a more, let's say, modest GPU, these results could be even tighter. And again, that's expected. And maybe something we'll, I don't know, look at in some future content, so let me know if you want to see that. Now at 1080p, where the CPU is arguably more important, both CPUs line up identically when looking at bang for buck comparisons. This shows that while the 7600X does offer up more performance, it's just a bit off the mark when factoring in the extra cost. For me, if something is 10% more expensive, I'd want a bit higher than that in comparative performance. And the 7600X just doesn't give that. That's not to say that it doesn't offer great value for money, because it does. But I just wanted something a little bit more. And in our tests, well, it just fell a little bit short. Another thing that the 7600 has going for it is that it does come bundled with a Wraith Stealth cooler, which, while not being the best cooler in the world, it does add value to the tune of around $15, and is more than enough to keep the 7600 under control during those longer gaming sessions. What's more frustrating is that the 7600 did perform better in a couple of titles, and that in theory shouldn't happen, but it did. And retesting, a fresh install of Windows, looking at CPU behaviour and temperatures showed nothing out of the ordinary. And instead, we have to put the blame on the game in question. But that's what's so good about testing in so many titles. We end up getting a more well-rounded picture of exactly what's going on. And you're always going to get an outlier or two when you're testing so many games. And while there are many reasons why you could see results like this when it comes to validating data, sometimes you just have to admit defeat and, well, go with the results that you get. If we had multiple games doing this, then yes, I'd argue there was maybe something wrong with the chip or even the way that we tested. But that's just not the case here. And instead, I have to say that, well, it is what it is. So, summing things up, I don't think you'd be wrong to go with either of the two CPUs, as they are both top of their game for value. But beyond speculating that the 7600 is just a 7600X that didn't quite make the cut when AMD was sifting through silicon, it does make you wonder what the point of the 7600 is, being so close in price and performance to the X. What I will say is that if you're in no rush and you're eyeing up one of these processors, I'd keep quite a firm eye on their pricing, because if one of them sees a significant drop in price, it could force your hand to buy one over the other. But at their current respective price points, they are both what you could argue, at least in terms of value for money, as identical. So that's going to do it for this one. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, then a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. And if you love what we do and want to help support the channel, along with getting a ton of cool and exciting benefits, then you can join the super special Patreon club. You'll get access to all of our charts, exclusive behind the scenes content, bi-weekly game nights, Patreon meetups at the eTechnics offices, and much, much more. The link for that stuff is, as always, down below. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.